Multimedia Publishing Incorporated, Denver, Colorado, presents the Get Acquainted series, introducing authors and places in American literature. This unit, written by Paul Friesen, introduces Nathaniel Hawthorne. In this unit, you will learn who Hawthorne was, where and when he lived, how his stories developed out of a sense of personal guilt because of the part his ancestors played in the persecution of Quakers and witches, and why he rejected the romantic idealism of his contemporaries. Nathaniel Hawthorne was a 19th century American author whose deep perception of man's moral and social responsibilities is depicted effectively in his short stories and novels. He saw man as basically evil, in keeping with the Calvinist doctrine, in contrast to the romantic view that man is basically good. Hawthorne was born in 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts, a city still under the strong religious influence of Puritan Calvinism. He was a descendant of the prominent Puritan businessman and magistrate William Hawthorne, who had migrated to Massachusetts in 1630, only 10 years after the Mayflower had brought the first permanent settlers. William Hawthorne and his son John had acted as judges and prosecutors of Quakers and witches in 17th century Salem, a fact which Hawthorne believed caused the decline of the family to a state of obscurity and poverty at the beginning of the 19th century when he was born. Nathaniel Hawthorne's father, a sea captain on a merchant ship, died of yellow fever in Suriname when Nathaniel was only 4 years old. His mother, too poor to maintain this home and to support her 3 children, moved to her parents' home, where she went into perpetual mourning and seclusion in her bedroom. She saw her children briefly once each day and came out to eat a meal with her family only once during the remaining 41 years of her life. Even during the few years when the family lived in Maine, she remained a recluse. With a mother in seclusion and 2 reticent sisters, Hawthorne grew up in an environment almost certain to destroy all creative capabilities. He was a shy, sensitive youth, yet active in youthful activities. An injury indirectly influenced the choice for his future career. While playing with a ball and bat, he accidentally hit his foot with the ball severely enough to cripple him for a time. While recuperating, he read Milton, Shakespeare, Spencer, Bunyan, and other great writers. At the age of 21, he graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine, where he established lifelong friendships with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Franklin Pierce. As a student, he wrote an unsuccessful novel entitled Fanshawe, but success was not to come until 12 years after graduation with the publication of a volume of short stories. This volume, entitled Twice Told Tales, was written following a period of 12 years during which he lived in Salem with no profession or job. However, he read much, wrote some, and burned most of what he wrote. In thinking about a career, he ruled out law, medicine, and the ministry. He wrote to his mother, "Oh, that I was rich enough to live without a profession. What do you think of my becoming an author and relying for support upon my pen?" In 1838, at the age of 34, he became engaged to Sophia Peabody. Although Twice Told Tales established him as an author, it did not provide the financial support needed for marriage. He worked briefly at the Boston Custom House, then joined the Brook Farm experimental community for several months. Finally, after 4 years of engagement, he married Sophia. Their first home was the Old Manse in Concord. According to this sign, the Old Manse was built in 1770 by the Reverend William Emerson, grandfather of philosopher and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of Mosses from an Old Manse, lived here with his bride, Sophia, from 1842 to 1845. The years in the Old Manse were pleasant and comfortable. Hawthorne began seriously to write for a living, but he felt some measure of shame in writing idle stories in a house long inhabited by ministers writing sermons. He hoped, however, that he would receive some special inspiration and wisdom in the spiritual atmosphere of the parsonage. During his 4 years of residence here, he wrote a volume of essays and stories called Mosses from an Old Manse. In the opening essay, entitled The Old Manse, Hawthorne described the house and the surrounding environment. The essay begins, "Between two tall gateposts of rough-hewn stones, we beheld the gray front of the old parsonage terminating the vista of an avenue of black ash trees." Hawthorne was intrigued with the secluded setting of the parsonage. It was the perfect home and location for a writer. While living here, he became acquainted with the literary people in Concord, such as Emerson, Thoreau, and Alcott. He admired their dedication and sincerity, but he was never able to accept their transcendental views. Their friendship, however, did much to broaden his vision and to help him realize the benefits of social relationships. Although Hawthorne dealt with the religious rather than the political history of America, he became interested in the nearby Old North Bridge and the monuments commemorating the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. As he looked out the window of the study in the Old Manse, he could imagine how its inhabitants had stood here and watched the fighting until the smoke from the musket fire swept around the parsonage. Hawthorne was impressed with the monument erected in memory of the first battle. In the essay, The Old Manse, he described it as an obelisk of granite, grown up from the soil that was fertilized with British blood. The monument is such as it befitted the inhabitants of a village to erect in illustration of a matter of local interest rather than what was suitable to commemorate an epoch of national history. The inscription describes the original scene. Here, on the 19th of April, 1775, was made the first forcible resistance to British aggression. On the opposite bank stood the American militia. Here stood the invading army, and on this spot the first of the enemy fell in the war of that revolution, which gave independence to these United States. Now, in Hawthorne's time, the river and its meadows were peaceful. He often gazed wonderingly at the river with its almost imperceptible movement. It may well be called the Concord, the river of peace and quietness, he wrote. Each tree is distinctly imaged and assumes ideal beauty in the reflection. Hawthorne perceived a moral lesson in the reflection. As the muddy water reflected the trees, so the earthliest human soul has an infinite spiritual capacity and may contain the better world within its depths. In 1846, Hawthorne, his wife, and their children moved from Concord to Salem, where he became the surveyor at the Salem Custom House. 3 years later, a change in political power removed him from his position, but the Custom House became immortalized in The Scarlet Letter. In the long preface to The Scarlet Letter, entitled The Custom House, Hawthorne described how he found in a deserted room a scarlet letter A, plus a brief written account of a woman who had worn the scarlet letter on her bosom. The woman's name was Hester Prynne. From the outline of the story which he found, Hawthorne constructed the romance of The Scarlet Letter, published in 1850. In this novel, Hawthorne demonstrated his ability to delve into the heart of man in order to discover and reveal the progressive ruin resulting from a guilt-ridden conscience. To Hawthorne, Hester Prynne represented the victim of severe religious wrath imposed by an unforgiving, unmerciful Puritan society. Hester, who could not hide her sin, was branded and ostracized. Her lover, a young and promising Puritan minister, kept his sin a secret, causing him continuous agony of heart as his unsuspecting, faithful parishioners praised his apparent spirituality. The story about Hester contains obvious autobiographical overtones. Hawthorne described his first Puritan ancestor in Salem, William Hawthorne, as a soldier, legislator, judge. He was a ruler in the church. He had all the Puritanic traits, both good and evil. He was likewise a bitter persecutor of any man or woman who dared to violate the sacred Puritan laws. In humiliation and regret for the cruelties of unrepentant ancestors who judged and punished offenders in the public scaffold, where Hester was made to stand for 3 hours, Hawthorne wrote, "I take shame upon myself for their sakes, and pray that any curse incurred by them may be now and henceforth removed." As Hester carried out the demands of her sentence, which called for wearing the letter A on her bosom, she gradually became known as an accomplished seamstress and as a readily available nurse. After many years, her kindness and helpfulness erased the stigma of the sentence, and people began to interpret the A to mean able. With this change in attitude, Hawthorne hoped to erase and remove the curse incurred by his ancestors. The minister also helped to expel the curse. Unable to contain his guilt any longer, he was finally driven to repentance and exposure on the same scaffold where Hester was sentenced. With his death, the sin was judged, and puritanical Boston purged itself. Hawthorne himself felt a cleansing of guilt as he revealed the actions of his ancestors. The revelation was not easy, because exposure meant possible ultimate family ruin, and establishing himself as a writer at this time was necessary, since he had lost his job at the custom house. The Scarlet Letter achieved immediate success. Within 6 months, he became known all over America, and within 2 years he was popular in England. The Scarlet Letter did not complete Hawthorne's attempts to purge the family name. The story dealt with only one aspect of Puritan judgment. A more severe form of judgment than Hester Prynne suffered occurred in the witchcraft trials held in Salem in 1692, when 19 men and women were hanged. 1 man was pressed to death, and about 200 were imprisoned. Suspected witches were tried here in the witch house by Judges Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne. The witch house stands as a reminder of the overzealous piety and irrational determination of religious leaders seeking to control evil forces. Although the persecution of suspected witches was much less severe in Salem than in some parts of Europe, the stigma of the hysteria of witchcraft placed a permanent stain on the village of Salem. The witchcraft trials captured the attention of Puritan theologians, public officials, and many authors. Hawthorne was particularly captivated not only because his ancestor John Hawthorne had been a judge, but because a curse had been placed on Judge Hawthorne by 2 of his victims, according to a rumor still believed in 19th century Salem. One of these victims, Philip English, had a daughter who later married Judge Hawthorne's son. As the blood of the curser and the accursed mingled through this marriage, the curse itself was nullified. The theme of an accursed household and the nullification of that curse provided Hawthorne with the ingredients for his second successful novel, The House of the Seven Gables, published in 1851. While not as popular as The Scarlet Letter, this second novel effectively portrays Hawthorne's sentiments regarding the degeneration of once proud New England families, including his own. This house, built in the same architectural style as the witch house, stands as a landmark on the shores of Salem Harbor. It provided the perfect setting for Hawthorne's story of a degenerating New England family, whom he named Pension. Hawthorne, living in Lenox, in western Massachusetts, when he wrote the novel, would not admit that he had this house in mind. The house, however, fits almost perfectly the description of the fictitious house of Seven Gables in the novel. His cousin, Susan Ingersoll, whom he had often visited, lived here. She mentioned to him one day that the house had 7 gables. Hawthorne is reported to have said half aloud, "House of 7 Gables, that sounds well." In establishing the locale of the house, Hawthorne generalized in the opening lines of the novel, Halfway down a by-street of one of our New England towns stands a rusty wooden house with 7 acutely peaked gables, facing toward various points of the compass, and a huge clustered chimney in the midst. The house, according to the story, was built in 1668 by the son of Matthew Mall, who had been sentenced and hanged for witchcraft by Colonel Pinchion, a stern Puritan judge. On the scaffold, Matthew Mall placed a curse on Colonel Pinchion, declaring, "God will give him blood to drink." Matthew Mall's property, on which the house was built, was confiscated by Colonel Pinchion, who died mysteriously shortly after the house was constructed. The parallels between the Pinchion family and Hawthorne's family are unmistakable. Following the curse, the Pinchion family fortunes diminished to the level of poverty for the same reason and to the same degree that the Hawthorne fortunes declined. Hawthorne believed that the sins of the fathers will be visited upon their children. This belief is the basic theme of the novel. In writing the book, Hawthorne used many of the features of the house itself, plus particular objects in the yard. In describing the pervading gloominess of the structure, he noted how each story of the house cast a shadow on the story below. One character, old senile Clifford Pinchion, described the house as a rusty, crazy, creaky, dry-rotted, damp-rotted, dingy, dark, and miserable old dungeon. There is no such unwholesome atmosphere as that of an old home, rendered poisonous by one's defunct forefathers and relatives. Another shadow was cast over the house by the old giant elm tree. In the story, Hawthorne wrote, "In front, just on the edge of the unpaved sidewalk, grew the Pinchion elm, which might well be termed gigantic. It had been planted by a great-grandson of the first Pinchion." Hawthorne was fascinated with the huge chimneys, especially the central chimney, rising from the hearths in the kitchen and the living room. Beside this great chimney, inside the house, a secret staircase winds around the chimney, offering a concealed means of going from one floor to another and providing a hiding place for valuable items. The garden behind the house provided one source of what little beauty and enjoyment existed in the otherwise melancholy surroundings. The garden was tended by a young man named Holgrave, who, it turned out, was the descendant of Matthew Mall. His eventual marriage to Phoebe Pinchion, the young and beautiful descendant of Colonel Pinchion, broke the curse which Matthew Mall had placed on Colonel Pinchion. The property itself was originally valuable for a natural spring of soft and pleasant water, a rare treasure on the sea-girt peninsula. In the story, Holgrave warned Phoebe not to drink from the well because the water was now bewitched. Hawthorne knew the house well, knew the story connected with the large red armchair in which Colonel Pinchion had died, and knew the episode concerning a secret recess in the wall behind the picture of Colonel Pinchion. In this recess was a document, possession of which entitled the holder to a vast fortune in land. Symbolic of the degeneration of the family was the perpetual silence of the harpsichord in the parlor. Music denotes joy and vitality. In Hawthorne's ancestral background, the music had been still for many generations, just as this harpsichord had been silent for over 200 years. When Phoebe first saw it, she did not know what it was, as it looked more like a coffin than anything else. Today, a visit to the house in the city of Salem adds to one's appreciation for Hawthorne's writings. Through his careful handling of the moral issues still hanging in the balance from Puritan times, and his assertion that there must be a balance between intellect and imagination, or the head and the heart, as he put it, Hawthorne skillfully brought into perspective some of the problems still existing from the zealous piety of the Puritan ancestry of New England. His fame now firmly established with 2 successful novels and many short stories, Hawthorne sought to retire not from writing, but from active civil or political services. Memories of Concord lingered in his mind, and it was to this pleasant village that he returned in 1852. He purchased the Wayside from Bronson Alcott intending to enjoy the comforts of this beautiful home for the remainder of his life. Hawthorne's political associations with President Pierce, who was generally disliked in Concord, caused Hawthorne to suffer some degree of ostracism in the village. He and Franklin Pierce had formed a lasting friendship at Bowdoin College. Now, Pierce insisted that Hawthorne write the political biography required of all candidates for the United States presidency. Upon his election as president, Pierce awarded Hawthorne with an appointment as the American consul in Liverpool, England. Once again, Hawthorne and his family left Concord, but they retained possession of the wayside. He detested his monotonous job and his cold office in Liverpool. At the completion of his appointment, he moved to Italy, then to several other places for brief periods, and finally back to the wayside. Upon his return, he constructed the tower on his house similar to a tower at the Villa Montuato where he had lived in Italy. It was designed as a secluded writing office, but it was usually too hot in summer and too cold in winter. Consequently, it was seldom used. In 1864, his health began to fail, evoking the sympathy of the community and of the former president, Franklin Pierce, who persuaded Hawthorne to accompany him to New Hampshire for his health. Instead of recuperating, Hawthorne grew worse. He died in his hotel room in Plymouth, New Hampshire, on May 21, 1864, at the age of 60. He was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. After the funeral, his friend, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was one of the pallbearers, wrote, "It was a lovely day, the village all sunshine and blossoms and the song of birds. You cannot imagine anything at once more sad and beautiful. He is buried on a hilltop under the pines." Nathaniel Hawthorne lives on in his written works which pay tribute to his greatness as an American author.